All right, everyone, welcome back. This is our 10th video in our video series of creating Node.js apps from beginning to end. In the last video, we looked at the database that we're going to be using for our Node.js apps. And in this video, we're going to look at how to use that database with our apps. So how we're going to do this is with a package from NPM called Mongoose. Mongoose is a driver for MongoDB that allows us to interact between our app and our database. So first things first, we're going to get our app set up and we're going to install Mongoose in order to start using it. So let's just run through it like we always do. I'm going to use the Express generator. So that's going to be Express. I'm going to set my view to Pug, and then I'm just going to call this I'm going to call it Mongoose app. There we go. CD into the Mongoose app, and then npm install. Alright, that's done running, so I'm also going to install NodeMon for my start script and Mongoose so we can use the database. Alright, and I see here that I've got an update to run. I'm going to go ahead and run this. Just npm I, and I is just short for install. So now you know, if you don't want to keep typing out install, just type I. And this is going to install the update for npm itself. So we're going to let that run. Alright, now that that is installed, we can go ahead and just open this all up in our text editor. There we go. Alright, now that we've got this, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go create that dev start script, how we always do. So, and if you remember from last time, I went ahead and copied this for the debugging purposes. So just paste that in there, and then I can say NodeMon. And what's it? Oh, it's blanking here. All right, there we go. Got that. Save it. Now I've got that, and I can use it. All right, so let's talk about Mongoose and how we use it. First thing we need to do is we need to import it, just like everything else. So just bring it in like any other package. And it's worrying me that that didn't autocomplete. Makes me think it's not installed. Let's try it again. Require Mongoose. There it is. I don't know why it wasn't popping up. Maybe you guys saw something I didn't. I don't know. All right. So either way, we've got it. So now that we've got it, let's talk about how we're going to use it. In order to access our database with Mongoose, we first need our database to be up and running. So first things first, let's go ahead and open a new terminal window and MongoDB to get that database up and running, and you'll see we have it running here on port 27017. So just going to minimize that, let that run in the background. Now, how do we access that? Well, that is a MongoDB running on our local host. So Mongoose allows us to connect to a localhost Mongo server pretty easily, and you could do this if you're using the Atlas cloud server as well. You're just going to have to change the URL that you're using. So let's go ahead and do mongoose.connect. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward name right there. Just this is how you connect to the database using Mongoose, mongoose.connect. So what it's going to take in is a URL to the database. So that's going to be MongoDB. And this is where it's going to be different if you're using the Atlas. You're going to have to put in right here your URL plus your username plus your password. And I think depending on how you set it up, you also have to set up other configurations. But for us, running it on our local computer, which I highly recommend, super easy, just localhost. There we go. Now, on our localhost, we can't just post to the local host. We need to access a database on the local host. So we're going to call it Mongoose app, because I'm just going to name my database the same thing that I named my app, Mongoose app. So just keep it easy. All right, so that right there connects us to MongoDB. However, let's say we have an error or something connecting the database. We want to know about that before we try to do something with our app, and then all of a sudden we can't connect to our database. So let's go ahead and say mongoose.connection, and this gives us a reference to the connection. So this connects us, and this gives us a reference to that connection. So we're going to say mongoose.connection on. So on this connection, if there's an error on this connection, what do we want to do? Well, we want a console.error.bind. This is going to bind an error to the console, and it's going to stop our app from running until we fix the issue that caused it. So we're going to pass in the console. That's what we're binding it to. And then we're going to pass in a message. Error connecting to MongoDB. And that'll let us know what happened, and then we can go in our code, figure out what happened, and fix it. So one last thing we have to do. I'm just going to type it out real quick, and then I'll explain it. All right, there we go. So what I've done here is Mongoose can return, with certain operations, it can return us a promise. And you should know what a promise is. If you don't, go ahead and check out my video on that. But you should know what this is. And what we're doing here is Mongoose can use several different types of promises, and we're just going to set this to the global promises we're using, which in this case is just the default JavaScript promises. You can also use popular libraries like Bluebird, or I think Q is another one. We're just going to use the default one, and that's the global one that we're using right now. So we're just setting that, and that's all we're doing. So that way we can use the proper type of promises later on when we're executing queries and such with Mongoose on our database. All right, so now we are connected and set up with our database. Let's go ahead and talk about how Mongoose structures our objects to be saved into the database. First of all, let's talk about why Mongoose does this. MongoDB itself at the database level does not require that you have any sort of structure. This is good and bad. It's good because you can save whatever type of data you want to any database. However, usually you're going to want to have some structure just to avoid utter chaos in your database. So you're going to want to have some sort of structure, and where we program that structure in is here at the app level, and we do that with Mongoose. So we are going to create a models folder, and in that models folder, I'm going to create a user model.js. So this right here is where we're going to define with Mongoose how the objects are going to look that we're saving into our database. So first we have to bring in Mongoose so we can use it. So Mongoose equals require Mongoose. And then the next thing we need, how Mongoose structures these objects is with something called a schema. So we're going to bring that in. So the schema equals mongoose.schema. All right, now that we have that, we are going to go ahead and create a schema. And a schema is going to just look like a normal JavaScript object, which is going to be very easy to parse into JSON and use and see the properties and the options on those properties. So let's go ahead and do it. So we're going to say let our user schema equal a schema. So we're creating a schema right here. This is the Mongoose schema that we brought in, and we're creating a schema with a constructor here, and we're going to pass in, say for our user we want them to have a first name, and the type of this property here is going to be a string. We don't want a number for their first name, we're going to want a string, and we're going to say this is going to be required, so require true. So the user has to give us a first name or we're not going to save them to the database. Let's also say they have a last name. The type is also going to be string. However, we're not going to require this one. The user has the option of passing us the last name or not. Username, we're going to say that is required, and it's also going to be a string. So type string and require true. And also one more thing, unique true. So these are a whole bunch of options that I'm setting on each property. And there's several different things you can do. You can specify a default. So if we wanted to say something here like default, I don't know why it's not popping up, default, and then just say like no last name or something. But I think that looks silly, so we're not going to do that. There's default, there's maximum and minimum if you want to store some sort of integer. There's all sorts of things, and they have these all in the documentation if you want to look at them. But if you follow along, we're going to be using a lot of these different options here. So we're going to say the email is also going to be of type string. It's going to be required. Actually, it's going to be the exact same as this. It's going to be required, and we also want the user to have to pass us a unique username, one that is not stored in the database already. And then finally, a password, and we're going to be bad right here and just say it's going to be a string. Normally, it would be a string and you would encrypt it, but we're not going to mess with an encryption package, although it's very easy to do, and we will be doing it in the future. We're just going to keep it simple now. So require, I believe it's required, actually. That's what it said. So let me go back and fix all these. Required. There we go. All right, so now we have a user schema defined with all the properties in the schema. That's great. Now, how are we going to access this? Well, first of all, let's export it out of our module. So module.exports equals, first of all, mongoose.model. This is how we're going to create the actual object to use with our app. First thing we pass into this function here is the name of the collection we're going to be storing this in our database. So I think we should store it in a collection named users. So that means all our users are going to be stored in the database Mongoose app and in the collection users. And now we just need to tell it what schema, which is the user schema, that we want to use. So this right here creates that object, and this is exporting it out so that later on we can go ahead and import it into other modules and go ahead and use this user object to create new users and save them to the database. So this is great, and this is our object. We created our object, but we can do many other things with schema. One of the things we can do is we can create a virtual property. So this is going to be a property that doesn't really exist in the database, but we're going to be able to access as if it does, and we're going to compute it based on other properties. So let's say we want to have a full name property. We don't want to store it in the database because it'd be silly to save a first name, a last name, and a full name in the database. But for simplicity's sake, we want a full name property that we can access. So we're going to say user schema dot virtuals, or dot virtual, just virtual, and then we're going to name it. We're going to say full name. So this is a property we can now access. So we're going to say get, and this is how we are going to put it into the full name property. We're going to create a function here that's going to return a value, and we're going to get that value and put it into the full name virtual property. So we're going to say get, and then we're just going to create our function here, and we're going to say return, and then I'm going to use backticks here and just say we're going to have two fields, and that's going to be a field of first name and a field of last name. So there we go, there we have it. There's our virtual property that has first name and last name. It returns that and creates full name out of it, so we can use that now. Another thing we can do is we can go ahead and do static and instance methods. So what's the difference between these? If you don't know, a static method is a method that can be used on the class, and an instance method is a method that you would think of as a normal method where you could use it with an instance of the class. So you would say something like user dot do something, as opposed to a static class where you would say the user class dot do something. So we're going to create a static class first. We're going to say user schema dot statics. Okay, so we're creating a static function. We're going to call it find user by email. So you can see where this wouldn't make sense to have a instance method where we already have the user. We wouldn't need to find the user using their email, but this is an instance where we only have the email and we want to find the user. So we're going to use this on the class. So here we go. We're just going to return user dot, nope, just user dot, oh, and the reason that's not coming up is this down here when we exported it, and later on when we import it in another module, we can go ahead and use it. But here we don't have actually access to it. So we're going to say let user equal this whole object. So this is as if we're importing it into this very module in which we export it. So this gives us access to that exported object. So now we can use it. So now if I said, there we go, it's popping up. User dot find one, and find one is a default Mongoose method that allows us to find something in the database based on a certain property, and we can pass anything in. So I could say my email can spell email at gmail.com. But here we're getting passed in an email that we want to use to find it, so we're going to put that here instead. So there we go. And now we're at the end of this, we're going to add exec, and what this does is this is a query, okay? So think of this as a query on the database, which is what it is. And a query returns a promise-like object, and we can do a lot of things with that object, but it's not a full-blown promise. Remember in app.js when we set the global promises to be the promises we want to use with Mongoose? Well, here is where that's important, because .exec, or I think execute would make sense is what that stands for me, is going to return an actual promise, an actual JavaScript promise that we can use. So that's why you add that to the end of your query so that you're returning a promise and not just a query. All right, so now that we have that, that is our static function. Let's go ahead and create a instance function now, or method. So we're going to say user schema as well, and then we're just going to say methods here because it's just a normal method, and then we're going to say compare password. So this is going to be a function that we are calling on a user object that we already have. So we're going to say password to compare. So we're going to pass it in a password we want to compare to the user that we're using at the current time. So we're going to say if this, or the user that we have that we're calling it on, so if this dot password if this dot password, so this is saying if the password of the user that I'm calling this method on right now, so I'm going to say user.password. Well, if that user's password equals the password that I passed in to compare to it, so if they are the same, then I want you to return true, else return false. So there we go. All right, so in this lesson, we learned how to connect our app to MongoDB over here in app.js with these 3 simple lines. We connected our database, we set some error handling on that connection, and then we told Mongoose what type of promises to use. And then over here in the user model, we defined a schema that's going to define our objects and create some structure for us. We also added a virtual property for convenience of full name. We also added a static method that's going to allow us to find a user by an email without having an actual user to call this on. It's a static method. And we created a normal instance method that allows us to call compare password on a certain user and pass in a password to compare to that user's password and determine if the passwords equal or don't equal. At the very end, we exported that object that we created with mongoose.model, and we defined the collection that we're going to be storing these users in and the schema that we're going to be using to create that object. We exported that object, and then we also got a reference to that object that we're exporting so that we could use it up here. And this right here is exactly how we're going to be importing it later on. We're going to say let user equal require ... models / user model.js, and that's automatically going to export this object that's created right here. So in the next lesson, we are going to keep using Mongoose, and we're going to see how to use some CRUD operations, or create, read, update, and destroy operations with our app on real user objects. We're going to be doing this using Mongoose and the routing in our users right here. So we're going to create some routes here that allow us to interact with our model, which allows us to interact with our database. So I'm excited to show you that, and I'll see you there.